Looking back at the movements of a person's life can paint a complex picture. Dates and places connecting threads of photos are what we are left with when no personal accounts are to be had. While the invisible nature of a person can sometimes never be discovered, we can glean fragments through their life's work, their family ties, and passions. Through coincidence during the last 40 years, it has been a curiosity to piece together an understanding of a man who has been relegated to obscurity as most men and women with enough passage of time. Let's take a look and bring to light one such man. Let us start at the unknown. John H. Parker, as best can be known, was born in Broughton, UK, a village of about 2,000 people. In 1860, he was born to an agricultural laborer and an innkeeper at Barnstable. His parents, of Irish and English descent, were already in their 40s when they had John, and also had two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, 14 and 17 years prior. Aside from John listing as a chemist's assistant when he was 21, there is little known of his upbringing other than what must be assumed he had a penchant for music of the day. During this time, in 1881, he emigrated to Montreal, Canada. A stepping stone of sorts, John quickly moved on to the already burgeoning music scene of Boston. Parker was published as early as 1883 with two pieces of banjo music, Hottentot Jig and Big Kettle Jig, published by Fairbanks and Cole, who began their banjo production in 1880. He followed up in the Gatcomb's Banjo Folio with Norfolk Jig, Bing Bang Gallop, Parker's Old Time Jig, Poolicky Jig, and Carroll's Favorite Reel. By 1884, he was playing with the Imperial Banjo Quartet in Boston, with J.G. Wild, T.A. Kimball, and W.A. Cole was one half of Fairbanks and Cole. A review of his performance in 1885 by the Boston Gazette stated he was deservedly encored for the manner in which he handled his instrument was simply wonderful, and all who had not heard of him should take the earliest opportunity of doing so. 40 years later, in a newspaper article, he claimed he was the leader of that quartet for 5 years and said to have been the only banjo quartet in the country in the 1880s. To his banjo artistry and aptitude, we can only speculate, but the case was growing stronger, which leads us back to the streets of Montreal. By 1860, Montreal was already the largest city in British North America and the undisputed economic and cultural center of Canada, with a population of 140,000. Montreal developed in what some historians call its golden age, as St. Jacqueline Street became the most important economic center of the Dominion of Canada. The Canadian Pacific Railroad began building the first transcontinental railroad in 1881. And Dalhousie Station, a former railway station in Montreal, Quebec, was built in 1884 and served as the first Canadian Pacific Railway terminal in Montreal. The last spike in the CPR was driven on November 7, 1885. The first transcontinental passenger train departed from Montreal's Dalhousie Station at Berry Street and Notre Dame Street at 8 p.m. on June 28, 1886. Seemingly, John Parker hit the ground running with unknown experience in England as he quickly immersed himself in performing, composing, teaching, and soon building. On July 28, 1932, in the Montreal Gazette, a Peter Butler, a horse-drawn cabbie, recalled early vaudeville in an article called "The Sidewalks of New York, Dwarfed by Old Montreal." As he stated in that article, the first good vaudeville scene in Montreal was given in a tent on the corner of University and St. Catherine. The players who came from New York regaled the residents with after-show rehearsals, which lasted into the wee hours of the morning. It was in the early 80s, that Jacob show. There was Bonnie Reynolds, the greatest little Dutchman ever born, Billy Barlow, minstrel singer, Lizzie Hunter, singer and warbler, and Sanford, who walked a tightrope across the street. Most of them rehearsed on the street after the show, and this performance sometimes attracted a larger crowd than the first, as it was free. The band used to play a half hour before the evening performance. Then came the show, which was frequently assisted by John Parker, a resident who could play 5 banjos at once. People didn't want the moon. They made a little go a long way. In the timeline of musical invention, banjo was about to begin its climb in North America. As one historian writes, 1880 to 1890 was the puberty stage for the banjo. It was among the highest number of recordings by a single instrument before 1920, and starting already before 1880. The market for banjos in 1880 was driven by word of mouth, print advertising, and music store teacher recommendations. By the 1880s, there was J.B. Shaw with the first printed catalog, S.S. Stewart in Philadelphia, and W.A. Cole in Boston. Although production can go back to 1861 with Buckbee. Buckbee was one of the first and perhaps most prolific mass manufacturer of banjos in 19th century America. He contributed significantly to making banjos accessible to the American public in the latter half of the 19th century. Shaw was a Chicago maker who had made many unmarked banjos, and many other banjos carrying the name of banjo teachers who sold their instruments to their students. By the mid-1880s, there was not one banjo that dominated. There was a constant flow of new companies making banjos. By the late 1880s, a full-blown mandolin boom began sweeping the country. The first mandolins manufactured in America were made by Joseph Bowman in about 1884. The tenor mandola was originally developed by Luigi Emberger in Italy in the 1890s, and the first 5-string banjarine was developed by S.S. Stewart in 1885 and was touted as the violin of the banjo orchestra. After 5 years in Boston, we now find John has traveled back to Montreal. In 1886, we have the first picture document of J.H. Parker, labeled as the noted banjo teacher of Montreal. He already has multiple instruments staged around him, and future depictions give credence to his ability to play multiple instruments at once. Listed in the business directories of Montreal from 1887 to 1895, he began his business of teaching, performing, and building. He marketed them as perfection banjos, guitars, and mandolins. Living close to the hustle and bustle on 2083 St. Catherine, John was only a couple blocks from Shepard's large music store, carrying Dobson's banjos, Bruno guitars, and a large assortment of sheet music. This close proximity would come back around in the future. Noted in the Gatcombs Journal for Banjo and Guitar in 1894, John Parker carries a large and varied assortment of instruments and is the director of the McGill College Banjo Club, which is one of the finest college musical organizations out. An Ottawa paper stated his trick playing was much admired, and the prettiest selection was a march entitled Ottawa. Gatcombs also asked for exclusive rights to publish John's banjo sheet music as the demand was so great. In August of 1894, John patented his first bandola, which he coined to offer particularly a guitar that had the treble and bass portions of the upper bout removed, leaving a pear-shaped body to give better access to the upper fingerboard. Whether John was aware of the bandola-type instruments that existed in Venezuela is unknown, but many acts from around the world were very popular in Montreal, so it can be assumed he was inspired by such hybrid instruments. The name bandola likely references a mandola-style wooden body with a string setup of a banjo. By May of 1895, Parker had resumed teaching at 131 Blurry Street and made his new working quarters at 2274 St. Catherine Street, formerly Shepard's Music. And now one of John's 5-string banjos from Montreal, which was found in England in the year 2012. Let's listen. Foreshadowing a change of venue in the McGill fortnightly, it was stated that the University of Vermont had attended a concert with McGill. The respected colleges showcased their banjo club selections, and Mr. Parker has brought the banjo club to a state of perfection. It can truly be said, nothing is wanting. It is safe to say the club of 96-97 has never been surpassed by clubs of previous years and is perhaps equal, if not superior, to any club of the same nature ever heard in Montreal. Montreal audiences know what to expect from Mr. Parker. He was born to please, and his solo lived up to his destiny, in which he seemed to make the banjo become a part of himself. McGill Fortnightly. During this time in Montreal, it should be stated that he was not a lone-driven man. In 1885, he married Elizabeth Emerson, and by the time of his first patent, 8 years later, a daughter Mildred was born. 2 years later, his second daughter Grace was born in Quebec, and in just 10 years, John H. Parker had solidified himself in the Montreal music scene and begun a family that would share and pass on his fervor for music. But that was about to change. In January of 1899, John left for Ottawa for his sister's funeral, and 4 months later, he was announced to be opening a new school in Burlington, Vermont on 183 Pearl Street. Railroad and road access between the regions, including the Central Vermont Railroad, which linked Montreal to Burlington and points south and east, made it relatively convenient and inexpensive to make the trip. As many English had come to Canada for search of work, many French Canadians immigrated to Vermont and New England in search of work. The trickle became a flood tide after the end of the Civil War, with the majority settling further south and east in Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. By 1900, 30% of textile workers of Massachusetts were French Canadian, 60% in New Hampshire and Maine. Parker was living with his family on 230 College Street in Burlington as he spread his teaching and performance schedule. He continued building upon his patent, creating the Bandola Company in 1899. The population was around 18,500 by 1900, and growing with the influx of French Canadians and ease of travel progressed. By the following year, he had already struck up a partnership with the McCannon brothers, but due to constraints, they fell short of their obligations. The McCannon brothers, who were not to take over 3 instruments per week, were to market them, display in their show windows, and were to pay Mr. Parker a certain % of the profit. This they did, the plaintiff claims, for several months and then refused to receive more instruments. The defendants claim that the contract was secured fraudulently, that the plaintiff abandoned the contract, that he had an invalid patent, and that his patent was an infringement on another patent. The jury returned a sealed verdict awarding damages at $1,127 in March of 1903 to John Parker. And George D. Jarvis worked for the company as a salesman and eventually bought out McCannon Brothers in 1905 as George D. Jarvis and Son. Upon moving to Burlington, his daughter, now 6, had already showed a marked aptitude for singing and mandolin. Mildred performed with John at the YMCA in Burlington, which would mark her first performance. 2 months later, in July, at the Queen City Park Pavilion, little Miss Mildred Parker was the feature of the evening and seemed to have acquired a wonderful mastery of the instrument. A 1901 showcase in the Cadenza listed a brief bio of her talents and credited her performance of her first solo concert consisting of 14 pieces, including Chopin, Grieg, Fauré, Mendelssohn, and Beethoven. Performances would continue throughout 1901 and 1902, including a request to perform for the Duke of York's coming visit to Ottawa. John and Elizabeth had another girl and boy while living in Burlington, Ruthven in 1903, and a boy Paul in 1905. Less is known of his continued performances and building during this period, but one can assume his drive for all things musical stayed the course as his familial and business obligations rose. We do know he was bound again for pastures beyond Burlington, as we find the Bandola Company newly advertised in Portland, Maine in 1908. Likely he was there even earlier in 1907, as his third son, Philip, was born in the Portland ward, and his daughter Mildred and he were already performing at the Ocean View Theater in Portland. John was 47 and Mildred was just 14. The population of Portland, Maine in 1910 was 58,571, making Portland the largest city in Maine. John opened his new bandola company on the infamous Durant Block, known for its diversity of shops and tradesmen. He was now advertising mandolins, guitars, banjos, mandolas, octave and tenor, as well as cello styles. John is now 48 years old, and a new student is about to change his life. Sometime in the first few years of teaching in Portland, Maine, John began teaching an Emma Van Tassel, who went by her middle name Dorothy. Living in Mars Hill, Maine, about 250 miles north on the Canadian border, Dorothy was 19 years old when she married in 1900 to George Barnes. She had 2 daughters with George in 1901 and 1906, Hazel and Marion, who she would later take with her to Portland, leaving her husband behind. Sometime in that period, between 1908 and 1912, Dorothy began taking banjo lessons with John Parker. Years later, it was noticed that the lessons were taking an ever-increasing amount of time. What began as an introductory lesson sparked a 20-year musical love affair. This fertile period is where the majority of photographic evidence comes from, not just between John and Dorothy, but also John and his daughter Mildred. Numerous playbills of theater performances have also come to light locally, including the Jefferson Theater in Portland, which opened in September 1897, presenting legitimate theater and vaudeville, and also the Bijou Theater in Bangor, Maine, which opened its doors on March 28, 1910, generally charging 5 to 10 cents for performances. Throughout the 1910s, John, Dorothy, and family kept up with his business and performances until his stepdaughters were old enough to also begin their mentorship with Parker and join the family band. Alongside this new endeavor, a curiosity which has caused years of confusion is the new name under which he performs. While he is still known as John H. Parker, all the documented paraphernalia now goes under the name Calvert-Parker's, the Calvert-Parker Company. Mildred performs under the name Mildred Parker or Mildred Calvert/Parker. For years, it was assumed he adorned this new name to match his new life, perhaps. And that may be the case, but the playbills do not suggest a full name, but a musical partnership, with the added hyphen, and Calvert being tied to his daughter, and not John himself. Regardless, he uses this new moniker, Calvert-Parker Company, for all known performances with and without his daughter Mildred. In some early performances of the family at the Jefferson Theater, we have John H. Parker, the man with the banjo, Dorothy C. Parker, the little lady with the guitar, Marion Parker, the girl with the fiddle, and Hazel Buster Parker, juvenile character vocalist. John must have had some wanderlust from an early age, as he was about to try again in another state a bit further south to finally settle down. By 1920, the family had moved to Keene, New Hampshire. As he states in his own words, "I was on the lookout for a nice New England city, not too large a size to settle down in. I was tired of traveling so extensively, and the children were getting to an age where they should have a more settled environment." He liked Keene almost the moment he got off the train on a week's engagement, and then decided to cancel the rest of the tour. And I decided to give it a try, and now I am here to stay. Here are 2 instruments that were passed down through his daughter Hazel to her son and grandson, built in Keene, New Hampshire, a mandolin and a bandola. On his workshop to build his instruments, the article wrote, he builds banjos, tenor and five-string, mandolins, guitars using mahogany, ebony, rosewood, spruce, and koa, which have been carefully seasoned before use. The metals required to come to Mr. Parker rough and are cut and shaped as desired in his 600 square foot shop. The banjo factory being the only one in New Hampshire whose sole worker is Calvert Parker. Material was brought in from the local lumber yard and is planed, shaped, sawed, and pieced together until it evolves into a finished product which has achieved a reputation throughout the eastern states. John created another patent in 1922 for a banjo structure that would result in much improved and richer tone, including a simple means to make adjustments to volume and tone readily, varied at will. His brand label in this period would be Peerless and Tone Built. John was 60 years old by 1920, but continued in his teaching, building, and performances, as well as always having time for his family. His daughters were known about town as the Parker Girls. Hazel Parker left for Boston in the summer of 1922 to study cello under child prodigy Carl Webster of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. The following year, Hazel and her sister Marion had a special performance on Springfield radio station WBZ with guest pianist Guy Wheaton, a prominent pianist. In 1924, at the age of 18, Hazel had become proficient in cello and got her union card from the Musician Mutual Association. In July of 1925, Marion was in Gloucester, Mass. as the conductor of the Union Hall Orchestra, while Hazel was the cellist. Marion also became the orchestral leader at the Majestic Theater in Keene, New Hampshire. Mildred, now 27, had moved on from Portland and begun touring billed as the Whirlwind Violinist in New England theaters down to the coast to Atlanta throughout the 1920s. Parker continued building until he had put up his house for manufacturing up for auction in October of 1928, sensing his decline until his death in Keene, July 8, 1929. His instruments and family are his legacy that have stretched to this time and place. Some other examples of instruments that were made while living in Keene, New Hampshire were this mandola, which was found later in 2008 in Hamburg, Pennsylvania. And lastly, in a Keene music shop in 2005, a guitar made expressly for the John H. Parker School. His daughter Hazel reminisced 40-plus years ago that through his love of music, they were inspired to become astute at their instruments. As her son remembered once sitting with Hazel in her living room just a few years before she passed, she started reflecting on the years, and was always the case, John Parker came up. She looked quizzically at her son and thought how kind John was to both her and her sister, and how he always had time for them, and wondered how he could have done all this, how he spent time making instruments, patenting instruments, performing locally and regionally, still doing vaudeville. On top of all this, he offered lessons to students and apparently had a small school. Other than a performance in Lewiston, Maine in January of 1930, there are no other known performances of Mildred Calvert Parker. Hazel named her first son Calvert, born a year after John's death, and Calvert carried on his mother's love of music and became a proficient pianist in his early years. Nearly 60 years passed before one of her grandsons, who had an early interest in guitar, found an old mandolin in the attic of their house. It had succumbed to the elements and had collapsed under the tension and heat. He wondered where this instrument had come from and was told fragments of the story told here. Over the next 35 years, he searched for other instruments and historical records in his free time, with much help from peers and aficionados who had already scoured these same fields of music. And as a consequence, in part, began his own interest in building instruments inspired by Parker. In the order of nature, we cannot render benefits to those from whom we receive them, or only seldom. But the benefit we receive must be rendered again, line for line, deed for deed, cent for cent, to somebody. Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Hark now the drums beat up again, for old true soldier gentlemen, then let us list and march, I say, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal and Spain. Queen Anne commands and we'll obey, over the hills and far away. All gentlemen that have a mind to serve the Queen that's good and kind, come list and enter into pay, then o'er the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal and Spain. Queen Anne commands and we'll obey, over the hills and far away. No more from sound of drum retreat, while Marlborough and Galway beat the French and Spaniards every day, when over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal and Spain. Queen Anne commands and we'll obey,